Look at all this peril. War and bloodshed, violence and disease. What sort of society could let this happen? What does a perfect world even look like? Well, good news! There are many examples from history of people crazy enough to dedicate their lives to finding out these very questions. Today, we'll be looking at a few examples of planned communities from history that tried to create heaven on earth, and the bizarre and unexpected outcomes that came from it. Fruitland. The 19th century was a time of immense social upheaval in the United States, owing mostly to the effects of the Industrial Revolution. As a result of the changes, many different planned communities emerged across the U.S. with varying idealistic visions of how society ought to run. One such group were the Transcendentalists. This authentically American movement in Christian theology is based on a philosophy which emphasizes the inherent goodness of the individual and the corrupting influence of humankind's institutions. It was a pretty big influence on American culture in the 1800s. Writers such as Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote extensively on the topic of transcendentalism, of individuals who returned to nature and transcended the physical world through deep thought and spiritual discovery. Sounds pretty beast. And it did to this guy as well, Amos Bronson Alcott. Alcott tried his hand at creating a transcendental commune located in Massachusetts known as Fruitland, no doubt named after the bananas ideas that inspired it. Founded in the summer of 1843, Alcott was able to attract a few members from the transcendentalist circles of New England to join onto a 90-acre plot of land, of which only about 11 acres was actually arable. Initially, the residents lived a hard yet rewarding existence, the men philosophizing about various issues of great import, while the woman, Alcott's wife, toiled to keep the farm afloat. However, you can't eat good conversation, so by the first winter, the community could not produce enough food to sustain itself, and it disbanded then and there. What Fruitland failed to realize is that humans are dumb, stupid dummies, and the only way we'll ever achieve any kind of utopia is if we become like God himself and achieve perfection. The Oneida Community. Founded in 1848 in upstate New York, the Oneida Community was a group of Christian millenarians who wanted to bring about the millennia-long reign of Christ to earth. And how would they achieve that? Well, by marrying each other and practicing eugenics, of course. The community was founded by John Humphrey Noyes, a radical preacher who viewed that man had to be free from sin if he was to bring about heaven on earth. And since there was no marriage in heaven, Noyes believed that the men and women should live in free love, communal marriages with one another. The community maintained a steady stream of membership for its entire existence, and even at one point was home to the eventual president assassin Charles Guiteau. Pretty neat. Okay. The community existed in relative isolation for almost 30 years, but it couldn't last forever. Its approach to child rearing made it a hotbed for abuse, and Noyes would be forced to flee to Canada in order to evade arrest, never to return. In response, the Oneida community abandoned the practice of complex marriage and eventually disbanded in 1879. They are now a cutlery manufacturer. Icarians. The Icarians were a group of people that followed the teachings of the French author and politician Etienne Cabet. Inspired by the various ideals of the French Revolution, Cabet's vision of society was one free from the rigid hierarchies of the Old World, where people lived together and were equal under the law, and where the flourishing of education and culture could take precedent over all other ventures. These ideas got Cabet banished from France for 5 years, where he wrote a book that described the hypothetical society of his imagination, known as Icaria. His ideas caught fire, and a movement to see Cabet's vision brought to reality was formed that probably numbered around 400,000 devoted Icarians. Stuff got very real when Cabet apparently procured the title to 1 million acres of land on the Red River in Texas. And with a so-called advance guard of 69 Icarians, Cabet set off to the U.S. to plot his brand new state. And of course, when the Icarians got there, everything was as it had been promised, and they're still speaking French in Texas to this day. Just kidding, that's not what happened. It was actually 25 miles up the river from where they had originally expected it to be, and was more like 320 acres of land rather than the million Cabet had been promised. Thoroughly discouraged and with most amongst them in financial ruin, many abandoned the project then and there. But still more stayed with Cabet and vowed to see Icaria's rise, even if they had to brave the hells of... Oh God, it's terrible! That's right. Before the Mormons left for Utah, they sold their land in Nauvoo, Illinois to the Icarians in 1849. And Nauvoo would become the home of these manic, wayward French people for the next 40 years, where the experiment to bring about utopia could finally commence. And it did go pretty well for them, all things considered. The Icarians got along modestly, establishing apartment dwellings, schools, daycares, performing plays, and discussing the works of Cabet in the town square. Of course, it was more or less run on the whims of Cabet, who, despite seeing the irony in his actions, ruled over his people with an iron fist. At this point, Cabet was getting pretty old, and in 1856 he died, and the Icarians would drift on rudderless, its members eventually disbanding to integrate into American society, the memory of their flight burning itself into the annals of the American West. Metaphors. If there's any conclusion to be made, it's that ambitious ideals require real-world application if they're to be effective. There may not be a perfect way to run a society, but there are certainly endless ways to destroy one. Brought to you by ScripTalk, talking prescription labels for the visually impaired.